Now I welcome Jeff Carpenter as the Program Committee Chair to introduce our first keynote speaker. Thank you.
I'm short also, so I got a microphone. It's really great to see so many people here. Thank you all for coming. Really hope you enjoy and learn a lot this week. So this past 30 years has been a journey for our community. We as a community have learned and grown and matured by working together and learning from each other. But we have also had a number of collaborators along the way in other communities that have worked with us and supported us, and all of us together have helped improve the state of cybersecurity. Our first keynote speaker today has been one of those collaborators who has worked with our community. Chris Painter has been in the Department of Justice, in the FBI, in the White House. Most recently is the chief diplomat for cybersecurity in the State Department. And through all of those positions that he's held, he's worked very closely with the CSIRT community. He was one of the first to recognize the value of the CSIRT community and the role that CSIRTs and national CSIRTs play in cybersecurity and how key that is in working with policymakers, law enforcement, and diplomats, both domestically within a country and also internationally. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce my friend and collaborator of many years, Chris Painter.
Can people still see me? There's a step, there's a secret step here, but you know. Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure being here with you today. As Jeff said, I've known Jeff for many, many years. I've certainly known this community for many years. And one of the things, as Jeff said, I used to be at the Department of Justice. I was a prosecutor doing cybercrime cases, but also was involved in a lot of the policy efforts when I moved from Los Angeles back to the mothership at Justice in DC. And I remember in 2003, I was chairing something called the high-tech, the G8, this is when there was a G8, maybe there'll be a G8 again, the G8 high-tech crime group, subgroup. And that group did a lot of work around networks of law enforcement, et cetera, to speed cyber prosecutions. But one interesting thing about that was that, we noticed pretty early on that there needed to be better collaboration between the law enforcement community and the CERT community. And there was a lot of distrust between these two communities. The law enforcement community didn't really understand the CERT community. They didn't understand what these technical people were doing. And the technical community looked at the law enforcement community with a lot of distrust too, thinking, you know, these guys are the law enforcement officers, they're gonna lock us up. If we give them information, they're not gonna know how to use it. There wasn't a lot of understanding in how information got shared. So through FIRST and through the G8 group, we brought law enforcement together with the CERT community. And I remember we had a big meeting in the Baltimore meeting in 2006, I think that was. We did preparatory work before that, where we had the CERT community and the law enforcement community get together. And it was very interesting. You know, the law enforcement community was all dressed in suits. You know, and you know, now that I left the tepid embrace of the federal government, I can now wear no tie, but normally I wear a tie too. So you'd have the law enforcement community on these suits, looking very serious. And you had the CERT community showing up, you know, dressed pretty casually, pretty low key. And we had this session that lasted almost a full day. And it was really interesting because after that session, you know, it took a while to break down those barriers, to get those two sides talking together. But that really continued throughout the FIRST relationship, to get the law enforcement and FIRST community, the technical community and the law enforcement community talking. And indeed, as I'll talk about later on, we also need that same bond between the policy community and the technical community. But I thought that was a really useful thing. And indeed, you know, on the first side, I remember one of the people, Jeff was involved, Yuri Ito, who was then at AP CERT and JP CERT from the FIRST community, was leading it on part from that side. And unfortunately, I don't think he's here, but Kauto from Finland, who many of you know well, took that first meeting very seriously and would call me or email me literally every week with a new lead that he had that he wanted to pass on to law enforcement. So he really hit the ground running on that. But that was really, I think, a very interesting beginning. And it really showed the value of the technical community collaborating with the law enforcement community in a really meaningful way. Now, as that portends, I was a prosecutor, as I said, so I am a recovering lawyer. And normally in settings like this, especially when you're the first morning speaker, you would tell a lawyer joke to kind of break the ice. Now, the only problem I've seen with that is through my years of experience, the problem with lawyer jokes is that lawyers don't think they're funny, and non-lawyers don't think they're jokes. So I won't tell a lawyer joke. I'll tell a hacker joke later on. I don't know any diplomat jokes. I'm now a recovering diplomat, but I don't know any jokes there. So today I wanted to talk about a number of things. I wanted to talk about some of the growing threats we're seeing, and all of you have seen this too, and I want to talk to you from my perspective about that. I want to talk to you about the role of diplomacy, my last gig in the federal government, in dealing with these issues and how that policy has worked out internationally. But I also want to emphasize something that Jeff and I were talking about yesterday, which is that obviously there are huge threats in the world, and obviously those threats seem to be multiplying and growing, both the technical threats and the policy threats. But at the same time, I think we'd be remiss to not recognize all the progress that's been made over the last 30 years. All the changes that have been made organizationally, but also our success in combating a lot of those threats. And I think that's really due to people in this room and other communities who really stepped up their game. That doesn't mean we won't have to do it more, but as I go through this, I want to present not just a glass half empty view, as prosecutors are wont to do, but also a glass half full view that we have done a lot and there's a lot of potential going forward. You'll also find out what this, a bunch of zombies, have to do with this, a bunch of old-timey diplomats. In fact, this is how we dressed in my office usually with the and also why I am so obsessed with this. For those of you who know me well and who visited me in my old office in the State Department, my office was festooned with pictures, posters, movie posters, of movies where either the computer was a main character or hackers were the main characters. And I've carried that forward after I've left the government. I post on my Twitter feed every week the cyber movie poster of the week. And I had about 30 of them on the walls of my office. And they were, they included The Matrix, The Net, The Computer Who Wore Tennis Shoes, Terminator, almost every computer movie you can think of. And most of those movies were not necessarily great movies. Some were good, some were bad. Sneakers, I think, was good. Others were pretty bad. Most of them were dystopian movies. But my favorite was this movie, and I'm going to talk about this more in a second of why this is my favorite. But because this is the 30th anniversary of FIRST, I wanted to use another one for this. This is the first, as far as I can tell, movie where a computer was the main character. It's 1957. It's Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn. It's a legitimately good movie. And it's a movie where, so about twice the age of FIRST, it's a movie where Spencer Tracy plays a computer inventor, network engineer, and he has invented an electronic brain, as they call it in the movie, called EMERAC, the Electromagnetic Memory and Research Arithmetic Calculator. And he's brought into this company to try to streamline its operations. And the head of the research, a research librarian, is Katharine Hepburn. And she is doing all the research manually, figuring out things. And she and the rest of her staff are worried about being replaced by this computer. And so this plays out. The computer, of course, malfunctions. And it fires Katharine Hepburn, but it also fires everyone in the company, including the CEO. It prints out pink slips to all of them. And so, computer malfunctions were common even back then. And so at the end of the movie, Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy, of course, fall in love. And Katharine Hepburn gives him an ultimatum and says, it's either me or your computer. And she starts to set the self-destruct mechanism, because everyone knows every computer has a self-destruct mechanism to destroy the computer. And of course, Spencer Tracy tries and tries, but he can't help himself. He saves his computer, but she still takes him anyway. So a happy ending. So that is in honor of the first computer movie, to my knowledge. But my favorite, again, is this one. And this movie was really the first computer movie where computers took over the world. So long before War Games or before Terminator, this was 1970. The US builds Colossus to control its nuclear arsenal and have perfect deterrence, take the man out of the middle. The Soviets, because it was the Soviets back then, built Guardian in the Urals. They stole the information from the US. They then built Guardian, a peer computer in the Urals. The two computers start talking to each other, become self-aware, and to protect humankind from itself, they take away all civil liberties and take all over the world. So I recommend this highly. If you haven't seen it, it's also a favorite of many in the computer industry. It's an eclectic movie. You can. I don't think you can stream it anywhere, but you can get the discs in some places, and I recommend it highly. Now, so that. I watched that movie when I was in grade school. I sat through the theater twice. I saw the movie 2 times in a row, which tells you a little bit about my personality, I guess. But it really fascinated me. And and my first computer back then was an Atari 800, which many of you may remember, that had a cassette tape drive. So I had a very early on computer. I was really into this, and of course now we have. We all have very powerful computers, as everyone knows, on our desktop, at our workplace, in our pockets with cellular phones, and it's really permeated every aspect of our lives, and all of the folks here know this well. And while the internet has been a tremendous force for commerce and social interaction and for good, and for connecting people around the world, it's also been a target for criminals and malicious nation states and terrorists. And while it's allowed people to organize and come together, it's also allowed more repressive regimes to monitor dissidents and undermine democratic processes. So just like anything else, the technology is not necessarily good or bad on its own, but it's used in both ways, and we've seen that around the world. And because of the global nature of computer networks, these issues almost always take on an international dimension. That was true when I was a prosecutor. That was true certainly when I was at the State Department. So it's been necessary for us to work, and the first organization is a good example of this, for us to work both nationally and globally, both to preserve and expand the benefits of computer networks, but also to combat their threats. And again, FIRST has played a major role here. And I've been doing this now. I started as a prosecutor in 1990. So I've been doing things related to computers for about 28 years, for a long time. Not quite as long as FIRST, but for quite a long time. And I've been lucky because I was a federal prosecutor in Los Angeles in the 90s doing some of the early computer crime cases, and I'll talk a little bit about those in a second. I went to the mothership at Justice and helped run the computer crime and intellectual property section. I went from there to the FBI for a brief time in their cyber division, helping run that. I went to the White House in the beginning of the Obama administration to help set up the cyber directorate in the National Security Council. And from there, I went to the State Department. And that time has given me a perspective on terms of the evolution of the threat, but also some of the things we've done that I'd like to hit on today. So, but it also gives me a good sense of how, as I said in the beginning, how far we've come, how much progress we've made, even though the challenges still remain. The other thing I think it's been fascinating is just seeing the beginning of a whole new field in this area, which is the cyber diplomacy field, which I helped start at the State Department, which I want to talk to, and why that's important as an aspect, just as important as what FIRST and other organizations do in really helping to build a more secure cyber environment for all of us. So let me talk about the threat first a little bit. Obviously all of you guys in this room know the threat better than anyone. Even for the people who are laymen, you see the front page of the papers every day, new stories, new threats, new issues. And the range of threat actors range from everything from the lone gunman hackers, as I used to call them, the individuals, to transnational organized crime, to terrorists, although terrorists have continued to use the internet more to communicate and to proselytize and to raise money and not really to attack infrastructure. We've been worried about that for about 30 years, but it hasn't happened yet, but it could still happen. And nation states, in terms of those who are seen as a threat to the U.S., our Director of National Intelligence have said that the main nation states are Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. But also are worried about proxies, nation states using proxies in addition to transnational organized criminal groups. And indeed, there have been many, many big cases over the years that I think have highlighted the risks involved. Now, the problem I see is that we've had these big cases and people really care about them for about a day. And then they lose interest again. And we still need to build that awareness outside of the communities that deal with this. But Equifax was obviously a big wake-up call for many people because it actually affected them. Some of the big ransomware attacks, which were not just ransomware, but in the case of NotPetya, for instance, an attack on infrastructure. So we had that. We had the WannaCry attack. Those were very serious. In my career as a prosecutor, one of the first cases that I worked on was the prosecution of Kevin Mitnick, who was the hacker who hit companies really around the world for an extended period of time, for about a 2.5 year period of time after he left custody when he was on parole in Los Angeles. And he left and went on the lam and then started hitting companies around the world, stealing their source code and other information that was in development. Back then, I think it was a more innocent time, and people weren't as dependent on a computer network. Certainly companies were. A lot of the systems he was getting into were company systems, telecommunications companies, cellular companies, software companies. But I think a lot of people who were just ordinary people thought he was more like a Robin Hood. He was just they didn't really understand why this was serious because it wasn't affecting them personally. And I remember when we were doing the sentencing for Kevin Mitnick. He pled guilty a couple weeks before trial. We had pretty good evidence against him, including him on tape, trying to get software from some of the companies, and a lot of the technical analysis that we had done. There was a plane flying over the courthouse with a free Kevin banner on it. So there was a lot of, I think, thinking, well, how serious can this be? But in fact, he caused, and he agreed in his plea agreement to have caused over $5 million of damage to various companies. So many companies that we didn't list them all by name to protect some of the companies since it was a plea agreement. We had company AA through double Z, I think. So we had lots of different companies around the world that were affected. But at the same time, back then, it was a serious event. There were concerns. There were things that he did both, that were the things we charged, and there were other things that were going on. And that was, one of the things that was at least rumored is he would hack into the telephone system and make problems for some of the people he didn't like changing their commercial or their residential phone to a commercial phone. So it asked you to deposit 25 cents was one of the stories about him. But back then, I don't think people understood the full seriousness of it. But since then, we've had an accelerating list of different things that have been high-profile things on the internet. One of the cases I also worked on in Los Angeles was one of the two first stock manipulation cases on the internet. And one was a company named Paragain in Los Angeles, where someone created a fake Bloomberg page that said that the company was being bought by an Israeli company. And because time is money in the stock market, people started buying up Paragain stock. It went up 30% in the space of about an hour and a half on NASDAQ. Now, the Israeli company, it was a holiday in Israel, so nobody could actually confirm the Israeli company. And because of the time difference in California, where the company was located, it was 3 hours behind the NASDAQ exchange, so people didn't understand. They couldn't get answers from there. And this person very cleverly created this fake Bloomberg page, which was very good. It was hosted on a web hosting service. But if you hit any of the links, the hot links on the side, it would take you to the real Bloomberg page. And then, what they did is they started using chat rooms, Raging Bull and others, to start generating some excitement about this, saying, this company is being bought. This is a big deal. They're being bought for $2 billion. This is great. And people who were very sophisticated, like including James Cramer, who still has a show talking about investments, invested in this and lost money because it turned out it was all false. And we were able to trace it down very quickly because even though they used this web hosting service, We were able to trace it down because the web hosting service, something called AngelFire, allowed you to create your own page, but you set up your account. You didn't really have to give much information. You just had to give a Hotmail account. And the Hotmail account was Joe Anywhere, from Anywhere USA. And using years of investigative knowledge from doing a lot of these cases, I realized that was probably false. And my FBI agent realized that. But we were able to trace it because AngelFire kept logs of where the account was set up from, the IP addresses. Those logs then went back to Earthlink. Earthlink kept radius logs. The radius logs tracked back to, these were, it wasn't a cable modem, it was a dial-up modem, so we had the actual location. And we were able to do a search, and we were able to find the person who, when we found him, said he just wanted to create some good publicity for his company because he always was getting negative publicity, and that's all he really cared about. He actually didn't trade. He meant to trade, but he got cold feet. So involved in those cases, there was another case back in the millennium around 2000 where it was one of the first big denial of service cases. And this was a case where there was a widespread denial of service attack on eBay, E-Trade, CNN, many other services around the US. And it turned out that it was a 14-year-old who went by the moniker Mafia Boy in Canada. And we were able to work with the RCMP, our counterparts there, and trace that threat down. And it turned out that we put a wiretap on the house in Canada, which the RCMP did. And we picked up on the wiretap that the father of Mafia Boy, who I'll call Mafia Dad, had ordered a hit on one of his colleagues. Now, that was, we cared about the computer case, but we decided to take the case down because that was a more important thing. And then we found out that the kid who did this was a juvenile, was 14. They prosecuted him in Canada as a juvenile. But it just showed the kind of asymmetric threat. And again, people were beginning to worry about that. And then, much later, when I was at the State Department in the White House, we had the Sony attack by North Korea, and how we dealt with that, because that was a nation-state attack, and how you actually deal with some of those issues, which was very interesting because part of the issues were attribution. Part of the issues is what you do to deter a nation-state, and I'll talk more about that later. And that posed a lot of interesting challenges because it was a private company, but the attacker was a nation-state. And then we had the issue of wholesale theft of intellectual property and trade secrets that one of our government officials called the greatest transfer of wealth in the history of mankind. I'm not sure, I think that's a little exaggerated, but certainly a lot of theft of trade secrets and business proprietary information that we were attributing to China, and I'll talk a little bit about how we resolved, or at least got to a better place on that later on too. We had the fear of debilitating infrastructure attacks. Estonia in 2007 really wasn't that, but it was, I think, the wake-up call for that. Some of the events in the Ukraine, I think, were very concerning about that. And we had the fear of screwing around with the integrity of the information. As my friend Thomas Silvis, the former president of Estonia, used to say, I worry if I can't get on my computer for a couple hours because of a denial of service attack. I worry more if someone changes my blood type, and next time I get a transfusion, I die. So we're worried about that as well. Internet of Things creates new challenges, and we've seen some of the attacks around that. I have an Internet of Things joke, so this is in development, so you can tell me what you think of this. I said this on a panel one time, and this is true. There was one story when a group of connected refrigerators were lashed together to attack financial institution websites. And I thought that was a great new example of freezing your assets. All right, it needs a little work. And then we have unforeseen threats that we at the cyber community in the US, as much as we've been working on this, as much as we were working with our technical colleagues, we just didn't see coming. The Russian interference in our democratic processes, both in the US and other places around the world, we didn't see that coming. That wasn't on our top threat list when we were looking at this, because it's more of a hybrid threat. It's cyber-enabled, but it's also a traditional influence operation. I think we have to be better at dealing with those hybrid threats. There are also policy threats, different futures, visions of the futures of technology. And there are some countries that view information in many ways as a threat to their stability. And The Russians tend to use the term information security because they care about the threat of information versus cybersecurity that we use. And there are countries that want to promote absolute sovereignty, drawing a line around their borders. When I often traveled to Beijing and had meetings with the government in China on a number of different issues, and I think it's important we do have those kind of meetings. But this is something that was in my hotel room at the Hyatt, and if you'll see, they're very nicely done logos for Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, Google, the New York Times, and Bloomberg. At the very bottom, it says, "Are not available in this hotel." We also have countries who are increasingly using the internet not just as a tool for growth, but also as a tool to monitor their citizens and to curtail speech, which is concerning. And there's really a battle in the developing world between stability and economic growth. A lot of the developing world sees a benefit in stability, but they also want economic growth. And so how can we make sure we have both? And there are multilateral bodies around the world that want to control the internet. They want to have government control of the internet rather than the system we have now, which is a multi-stakeholder one. And beyond that, over 100 countries in the world are developing offensive cyber capabilities. It's become a new domain of warfare, and that creates a lot of challenges. So I often say cyber now is the new black, that everyone cares about cyber. They don't know what it is, but they all care about it, and that's good. And I think we are actually making a lot of progress in combating those threats. And there's been lots of progress both domestically in the US and around the world, but also internationally in terms of our cooperation. First, one key observation I want to make is that it's not perfect yet, but we're in a transition period that I think is very important. That it used to be that cyber was just seen as this technical issue, this niche issue, where if you went to a cabinet level or a minister, or you went to the CEO of a company and you talked about cyber and cybersecurity, they would look at you like you were kind of crazy. They would say, you guys go and deal with the technical experts, you talk to the CISO, if there's even one at the company, you talk to the technical experts and the government. And they never really treated it as a serious policy issue. And I think the change now is that increasingly countries are treating it as a core issue of national security policy, of economic policy, of human rights policy, of foreign policy, and that makes a big difference. If countries are beginning to not think of this as this boutique issue, but a core issue of your national security policy, that means they're going to start paying attention to it. Now, as I said, it's not complete yet, and there's a lot more work to be done, but I think that's a serious transition, and I think that's good for everyone in this room because you are the people they need to talk to as they treat this more as a policy issue. And they don't have to be technical experts. You don't need the president of a country, and there are a few are, like the former Estonian president was, and some others, who are experts. You just need to be able to reach back to the experts and understand some of the core policy issues. We've seen governments become far more organized. My own government, we used to say we had silos of excellence. We had all these different parts of our government who were great at doing their own thing, but never talked to the other parts of our government. And that's true around the world. And one of the things we did in my government when I went to the White House is we had a cyberspace policy review where we looked at all of our policies, and we tried to bring those different elements together. And we had many meetings about this. We had people getting together. We had organizations created like the national, like our cyber response group, which brought all the agencies together to look at major cyber threats. Had both the technical and policy people, and that was important. We did an international strategy for cyberspace, but now countries around the world are doing that as well, including in China and the UK, and others have international strategies now. And we created, I was created my old office at the State Department, which is the first office anywhere in the world that did cyber diplomacy. And brought all this basket of issues, cross-cutting, everything from issues around human rights, to issues around internet governance, to issues around cybersecurity and cybercrime, to international security issues and how do you prevent conflict and war in cyberspace. So all those issues were housed in my office, and now there are something like 27 other countries who have offices like that around the world. And almost every country is now developing an office in their foreign ministry that deals with these issues. And again, that's important because it's not just the technical element, although I had technical people in my office, it is also the policy element and elevating it to this issue. And as I said, our scope was cross-cutting. Now, unfortunately, my office was kind of disbanded when shortly after the new administration came in, because apparently this is not a problem anymore. But I'm pretty confident it will be recreated now because I think they understand the seriousness of this. But 27 other countries have now done this with a growing number. With a wide scope of the different issues we deal with, we launched whole-of-government dialogues with countries around the world, including Japan, for instance, was the very first one we launched. But we have Japan, South Korea, Brazil, India. We had a dialogue with China. We still have a dialogue with China. We had a dialogue with the Nordic Baltic countries and others. And we'd bring all the different government players, not just the State Department, not just the Foreign Ministry people, but our defense people, our DHS people, our law enforcement people, our human rights people. And they would bring all the people from their side. And we bring our technical people, too. So you'd have that interaction, which was really important. And that also helped us promote a number of things that we were doing beyond that, including operational international cooperation. In cybercrime, we've been working to promote the Budapest Convention for cybercrime, which I worked on when I was at Justice. We created in the G8 something called the 24/7 network, which now has over 60 countries, which allows quick coordination on cybercrime issues. In cybersecurity, one of the key things we did was with this community, with the CERT community, and working really hard to make sure that countries had national strategies in place that included key components like what structures you need to have, including cybersecurity, and including having a national level CSERT. And I think it's really interesting to note that Jeff and I were talking back in 2003 when there was the first CSERT meeting. There were only 10 national CSERTs. Now there's something like 124 of them, and that's a great statistic. That means more countries are doing this and they're understanding the importance of this at a national level. Now, some of them have limited resources, and that's a challenge, but I think that's really important. We've been using we've been promoting that issue. We've also been using diplomatic tools to combat operational threats. Remember when I told you what zombies had to do with diplomats? When we had the big denial of service attack that came from Iran that went after our financial institutions for about a year-long period, one of the things we did is we considered all our options. Our technical community talked, these are botnets, so they're spread all over the world. There were concentrations in Germany and other places, but they're spread all over the place like any botnet is. So we looked at our options. And one of the options we had was to do what's called a diplomatic démarche. Now, that just sounds like a nasty thing, but it can be a positive thing. It could be, hey, can you help me? So we did a démarche to 24 different countries around the world where these botnets were concentrated, where the bots were concentrated, and said, can you use whatever tools you have, whatever laws you have in your country to help us mitigate this? And that was very, very successful. So it was creating this network both at the technical level that the certs have already done, but also on the policy level. And that's how zombies and diplomats actually work together. And we were trying to build international networks to deal with these shared threats so that we can call on this time and time again. And negotiation is another area where I think we made some real strides. I mentioned the issue with China. That was a big sticking point between the US and China for quite some time. And we after really 2 years of sustained diplomatic efforts, we were able to reach an agreement with China that no country should steal the intellectual property using cyber means of the other to benefit their commercial sector. And that became not just an agreement between the US and China, but an agreement that was enshrined in the G20. Australia reached an agreement, the UK reached an agreement, and Germany reached an agreement. And that really helps because that creates a norm, an expectation, a level of accountability that I think really was very helpful. And then another big effort that we engaged in is capacity building. And here again is something where I think there's been a tremendous amount of benefit, a tremendous amount of work from the CSERT community. Some of that has been doing the training that the FIRST community does and doing the CERT development, the training that the CERT community has always been valuable and part of. We worked very hard in my office with the Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon to design a CERT training where we worked around the world in doing that. The Organization for American States has a CERT building training in that region. APEC and ASEAN have done some work in this too, which I think is really important. We've tried to include technical training as part of our overall training that we've done in sub-Saharan Africa that my group has done. There's something called the Global Forum for Cyber Expertise that was launched by the Dutch. They had the incident response meeting just here yesterday with first members. There's several working groups, and this is, again, a capacity building effort. I chair something called the Strategy and Policy Group, which is looking at things like national strategies and how we make sure that we're helping countries and filling the gaps around the world. I think the capacity building is one of the most important things that us as a joint community can do, because more and more countries really need to have the ability to work on these things, and I think that's important. So I think that's been a really important effort over the years. And then the other thing I think that we have been doing, so capacity building is important, negotiations are important, dealing with threats is important, but we also have to look to the future. And as I said, many countries are developing cyber weapons and cyber capabilities. So we need to try to shape the international environment to have better long-term cyber stability. And that includes a framework for cyber stability. International law applies just like it does in the physical world. It applies to cyberspace. They're not so totally different. That there should be certain norms of behavior, rules of the road, voluntary rules of the road, and that there should be what we call confidence building measures, that countries can talk to each other, having hotlines in place, having doctrine exchange, the only real analog to the nuclear world. Mostly governments have been involved in this, but also this Global Commission for the Stability of Cyberspace I'm now a commissioner on. It's been helping evolve this. There's been work in a lot of different forums. So one of the things, as I said, we've been working on is norms, not these norms. That's Norm from Cheers, Norman Schwarzkopf, and Norman Mailer, in case you didn't see them. But these norms, which are peacetime norms. What are the norms of behavior below the threshold of armed conflict? People always talk about cyber war. I think they're overdoing it. We haven't really seen much in the way of real cyber war, but we see a lot of activity below that threshold. So we've been working on what are things that states should not do, what are norms of restraint or cooperation. And the ones laid out here that were agreed to by countries around the world, including China, Russia, the US, the UK, the rest of the P5, but also many other countries, and increasingly countries are joining on to this, is a state shall not conduct or knowingly support cyber-enabled activity, as I mentioned, on the theft of IP that benefits the commercial sector, that a state should not conduct activity that intentionally damages or otherwise impairs critical infrastructure that provides services to the public, that is something below, when you're in wartime, different rules might apply, but when you're not in wartime, you shouldn't do that. A state should cooperate consistent with its laws and international obligations. When there's a malicious code coming from that state and another state asks it, they should use either technical means or law enforcement means to help mitigate. And then particularly for this community, this one, which was agreed to again in this international setting, and one that we think is really important, which is the state should not conduct or knowingly support activity intended to prevent national computer security incident response teams from responding to cyber incidents. So we view the CERT community as the hospitals, as the ambulances, and that states should not attack those CERTs, and that I think is a very important norm for this community, and one I think this community can help institutionalize and spread around the world, because that's very important. There's a second part of that a state should not use CSIRTs to enable online activity that is intended to do harm. So CERT should be used for good, basically, and that's really important too. And then this commission that I'm a member of has gone beyond that and has proposed another norm, that states and non-state actors should not do any activity that would fundamentally make unavailable and damage the general availability and integrity of the core of the internet, the domain name systems, the routers, the key things that make the internets work. And we're working on other norms as well there. Now, that's important. Having rules of the road is important, but you can have all the rules of the road in the world, and if there's no enforcement, if there's no consequences for people who violate those rules, then they're really pieces of paper. They're just written on pieces of paper. So deterrence in cyberspace is, I think, something we all need to think about, and as part of our tool setting and making cyberspace more secure generally, we need to think about what that means. And what that means to me is deterrence generally means you have a credible and timely response. And if you think about all the attacks that we've seen over the years, both the nation-state attacks and the other attacks, our response hasn't been very timely, and it hasn't been very credible. And look, there are reasons for that. There's issues around attribution. I remember with respect to attribution, when the North Korea attack on Sony Pictures happened, everyone in the community said it was North Korea until President Obama came out and said it was North Korea. Then a lot of people in the community said, well, it's not North Korea. But we know it's North Korea. We couldn't share all the evidence, and this is one of the problems, because countries are never going to share all the evidence they have, particularly if it's sensitive or classified evidence. But we shared a lot of it. And we need to be better at getting to attribution quicker, as we were able to do in that case. Now, apparently, I heard Seth Rogen recently, the noted computer forensic person, Seth Rogen, has now decided that he doesn't think it's North Korea. But we need to be able to share that information, get other states to join with us, and do a better job of creating costs on bad actors, whether they be nation states or criminals. Now, for criminals, it's easy. Relatively easy. If you can apprehend them, you put them in jail. For nation states, it's a little harder. But we have to use all the tools we have in our tool set, everything from diplomatic tools to economic sanctions to law enforcement tools to cyber tools, although I think cyber tools were often overrated, to everything we have, and even come up with some more tools working with the technical community that will actually try to punish bad actors and make sure that in the future they think twice about doing something that's going to cause widespread harm, like NotPetya, for instance. So I think that's something where we need to do this. We also need to do this collectively. I mean, I think first there needs to be a better dialogue between policymakers and the technical community and figuring out what the options are. But it can't just be, or it shouldn't just be, one country acting alone. If the flaming cyber ball of death is coming toward you, every country has a right to defend itself. But you're much better off if you're working with other countries and doing a more collective response. And I think that's something we're pursuing. It was interesting in the NotPetya example where Russia was named, it wasn't just the US, it was the US, UK, a number of other countries around the world that came to that conclusion. I think that's very helpful. And then I think we also need to really figure out how we deal with some of these hybrid threats. As I said, the interference with our electoral systems is something we didn't see, so we need to figure out a better way to do that. And what that requires, I think, in an unprecedented way, is a lot more cooperation, again, between this community and the policy community, for us to understand what the range of options are and actually use those options, and how we can actually deal with some of the issues that are now affecting us, the unanticipated threats that we hadn't seen before, and really have that better connection between us. If we want cyberspace to be something that is just not filled with threats, which many people are fearing now, where it doesn't break down because of the threats that are out there, but really continue to be the engine for growth and commerce, it really is imperative that we work together. And all of us are part of that solution. You're part of the solution. The policy community is part of the solution. They shouldn't be scared of each other. They should be working together. I said I would tell a not lawyer joke, but a hacker joke later on. This joke, by the way, is almost as old as first, but I'll still tell it. A hacker is walking down the beach. He finds a lamp. He rubs it. And predictably enough, a genie comes out. And the genie says, look, because you're a hacker, there's some strings attached. You get 3 wishes, but there are some strings attached. And the hacker says, okay, what are they? And the genie says, well, everything you wish for, every other hacker gets twice as much of. So the hacker says, I can live with that. So the genie says, what's your first wish? And he goes, well, I want a Cray supercomputer. So he gets a Cray supercomputer. But every other hacker gets a Cray supercomputer and IBM's Watson. And again, hackers are competitive people. This really bothers him because he doesn't have the edge on all these other hackers. The genie says, "Well, what do you want next?" And he goes, "I want a million Bitcoin." So he gets 1 million Bitcoin, but every other hacker gets 2 million Bitcoins. And again, it really irks him. And the genie says, "Hurry up! What's your third wish? I want to get back in the bottle and watch I Dream of Jeannie reruns. What do you want?" And the hacker pauses and he thinks about it and says, "I'd like to donate a kidney." And they all die. which tells you, and you guys all know this too, and this has certainly been true in my career, that the people who are attacking our networks have become ever cleverer and more sophisticated. Yes, there are still the ones who are stupid, and that's great. I used to be, when I was a prosecutor, I loved stupid criminals. I had a bank robbery case where someone came into a bank with a mask, gave a note to the teller, but was wearing his name tag from next door. Stupid criminals are great, but we can't count on stupid criminals. We can't count on stupid hackers. There are many sophisticated ones, and they're getting more sophisticated. I think we just can't also think about the threats. You remember when I talked about Colossus and the Colossus taking over the world? Well, for those of you who know, who've ever been to Bletchley Park in the UK, where they broke the Enigma code, and then they also broke the Lorenz code, which is the code the Nazi high command was using. This is the original Colossus, and it was used to break that code. So rather than computers being thought of, as many people do these days, as something that might enslave us while empowering us, this is an example of computers really doing good for society, and we need to reinforce that. Instead of the dystopian future that all these movies give us, we want to have a more positive future. So instead of Colossus, the future I think we want is not this, which would be the dystopian future, but this. And unfortunately, this is not a computer movie, but having, this is the future that we really want, to have everyone really be able to use these technologies and grow these technologies. And this community is a core part of that. The policy community is a core part of that. I'm happy to have dealt with you for all these years, and I look forward to continuing to work with you in the future. And with that, I'm going to close, but I want to open it up to questions because I like this to be a little interactive too. Don't be shy.
I'll ask the first question. As you look at how much we've matured over the past 30 years, what do you think maybe the next 2 or 3 things that the community, including the diplomatic community, has to accomplish next?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is still this basic awareness raising. And I think that that's a place the technical community, I mean, I often hear frustration from the technical community that the policy community is not listening to them or doesn't understand what they're saying. And so I think there are opportunities now as countries are setting up national strategies, as countries are setting up diplomatic teams. This presents a real opportunity for the technical community to interact with them and to knock on their door. If they're not knocking on your door, for them, you to knock on their door. And I think the opportunities are, to get more of the other countries involved. Yes, some of the big countries have been involved in these discussions, but it's not really around the world yet. A lot of countries are still building up their capabilities, which is important, but they have to be part of these conversations. They have to be part of the stability conversation. They have to be part of the consequences conversation and the deterrence conversation. It can't just be 3 or 4 big countries or even 10 or 15 big countries. It really has to be worldwide. So I think this community, especially given its spread, can really help with that. And in countries where there's not a tradition of having these structures in place, really help jumpstart them.
So, is this on? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I'm a journalist, first of all. I have a question about something that just came up recently from David Sanger's most recent book, and that's regarding Mandiant's efforts to identify APT-1 as a Chinese military operation. In the book, Sanger describes Mandiant investigators actually enabling the laptop cameras on the actors' machines and following their keystrokes, presumably with a logger, he doesn't specify. And so the question, of course, is raised about a private company engaging in some kind of hackback activity, not against a normal criminal like taking over a command and control server, but a nation-state actor. And so I'm wondering, in terms of from the Justice Department's viewpoint, what are the legal parameters for a private company engaging in something that ordinarily the NSA would do, because these were Chinese military computers? And what do you consider sort of the national security implications for repercussions that can happen when a private company starts engaging in that?
So first, let me caveat this and say I'm not going to comment on the Mandiant case in particular. And also, I no longer work at the Department of Justice. I no longer work at the government, so these are not their views. But I'd say this more generally. There's been a lot of debate in the U.S. about this idea of hacking back, of private companies hacking back. And there's various gradations of this. I mean, part of it is gathering intelligence, especially if you've lost information, and that's one thing. If you're actually engaged in hacking back, there are real concerns there. And there's been some bills floated in our legislature about this. Some people love this idea of what they call letters of marque, enabling the private sector to hack back into computers in other countries. The problem with that is just on a technical level, and you guys need to know this, if you're a smart computer attacker, you're not going to come directly from your home box. You're going to route it through several other boxes around the world. That's certainly, when I was investigating these cases, we saw that all the time. And so if you're trying to hack back, especially, not everyone in the private sector has the same capability, just like not everyone in the government has the same capability. If you try to hack back, you may well end up hitting an innocent third-party box. And that, that itself would be a crime, A. You also might end up doing it in a country you didn't realize, say Germany, for instance, which would cause an international incident. So I'm not fond of the idea of the private sector hacking back. I think that that's something that is a problem. Now, I understand the frustration of a lot of the people in the private sector who say, well, how do we protect ourselves? There's a lot of things that can be done to protect, to investigate, that fall short of hacking back.
You mentioned as one of your tools in your toolbox sanctions, but sanctions are the reason that some of the teams that we would like to have in our community cannot attend. And personally, I feel this kind of kills our ability to work together in cases where we do not have a disagreement and actually weakens the global cybersecurity. What are your views on that?
So, I mean, I think we have to look at how we apply these tools. I think the problem that we've had with sanctions is that if you're going to do deterrence right, you're going to have to look at each individual instance and you have to say, what is actually going to change your behavior? And sometimes the sanctions, I think, you do broad sanctions instead of more narrow sanctions. So, if you're going to change, the behavior of certain regimes, the sanctions have to actually have some effect on them that's going to change their behavior in the future. So I think we need to do a more targeted view there. Look, but I also understand your point that, when you sanction entities, they can't travel and there are problems with that. Depending on what the circumstance is, that also means their government should be behaving more responsibly because sanctions are reversible. The thing about sanctions is you can reverse them. And if the government is changing its activity, it's not engaging in that, then you can reverse those sanctions. And often the sanctions are more individually based, and if they're individually based, there's evidence behind them. Hi.
A lot of the topics brought up today have been about hacking and remote breaches. If we look back at the Target breach, the HVAC system breach, have you seen trends in increases or advances in the integration between physical and logical security?
Yeah, yes. Because there also is a worry about some of the physical breaches that can enable cyber breaches. So there is a remote breach, which is one problem. There's also insider breaches, which is something we've been concerned about this time, closed access breaches. And I think that means you have to build more of an understanding between the people who do physical security and cybersecurity. Now, I think a lot of companies that's happening. At DHS, I think they tried to combine that as well, so you have a better understanding of this. And even among, and just in terms of cybersecurity, different industries have different levels of experience and also different levels of sophistication. The tech industry and the communications industry largely get this. The financial industry kind of gets this. But a lot of the other industries, manufacturing and others, have a long way to go. But you do have to build those bridges, not just with those industries, but also understand how physical security and cybersecurity interrelate. So I totally agree with you.
Thanks.
Oh.
Yeah, so this is a very general question. When talking to government officials, policymakers, especially diplomats, I have some difficulty in make them understand who is CSIRT or what is CSIRT.
Yeah.
CSIRT might be very difficult for, majority of diplomats. So can you advise me, how I can
get them to understand.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I'd say is we, in the U.S. we had my office, but we also had diplomats all over the world in every one of our posts who one of their jobs was to do cyber. So they might, depending on the embassy, they might have had several other jobs. Some of the embassies that were full-time cyber people, that's what they, they specialized in. And we trained them. We brought them back to D.C. and we had them do regional engagement strategies. We brought them back to D.C. and we had a full week of training. And among them, we had a primer on how the internet worked and what cybersecurity was. We had people from the CERTs come in and talk to them about what CERTs were and what that meant, to give them that level of education. And some other countries, the UK has been doing this, some other countries have been doing this, and that's really important to try to build that better understanding. The other thing we've tried to do is to get some of the diplomats together from other countries and have meetings where we talk about these issues too, because you're right. In the US, I was chosen to be the first one that did this. In some other countries, it could just be an ambassador who came back from being the ambassador to, wherever, and now is charged with being the cyber ambassador, and they know nothing about cyber. So you have to educate them. And But that's worked out pretty well. I mean, I think they're really willing to learn. I think Japan's a great example. Japan has had a number of cyber ambassadors over the years, and they come in usually not having much cyber experience, but they learn very quickly, and I think that's important. So that's the other thing I think that this community can do is, if you have someone in your government who is charged with this mission, go talk to them. Offer them some, I wouldn't do the technical challenges with them, but I would talk to them about some of the basics of what you do and why it's important when they do capacity building, when they're engaging with other countries, why this is a critical component that they want countries to have. And I think we're making some progress on that.
Any other questions?
So regarding cyber diplomacy, can you talk about some of the verification efforts that are made to kind of prove that countries are abiding by their agreements?
Yeah, and this is a difficult issue. This is why people say deterrence is difficult in cyberspace, because you can reach agreements. People can agree to do a lot of things, but how do you verify it? Especially because cyber tools are things that could have dual-use purposes. They could be for research. They could be for malicious purposes. One of the things we focused on, the norms, those rules of the road I talked about, were not the tools themselves, not saying a tool is banned, but saying the effect is banned. In other words, don't use it to cripple a critical infrastructure. And in fact, if a nation state is doing that, some of the activities we've talked about, especially if they're doing it for a prolonged time, we can do attribution. I mean, there are challenges to be sure, but attribution can be made. It's not just following the digital footprints. It's looking at all the information you have, motive, intelligence, everything you have, and make that attribution. Now, it may take a while to do that, but we can. So I think that's the way we do verification. Now, I would admit it's much more difficult than in a nuclear world where you see a launch plume and you know that someone's done it. But it's something that I think we have been getting better at, and we need to make sure other countries can get better at too. But there is still a sense, I think, among a lot of actors in cyberspace that it's a cost-free zone. They can do it without risk of any cost being imposed because of this issue of attribution and verification. I agree that verification is difficult, but I just don't think it's impossible.
Quick one for you.
Oh.
This sort of two-part principle that you alluded to about halfway through of sort of establishing national certs as being something like the Red Crescent or the Red Cross, do no harm, and that's off limits. What kind of traction have you been getting, and where have you been sort of vetting that notion?
Yeah, I mean, quite a bit, but I think that particular norm, and we got agreement in what's called the Group of Governmental Experts in the UN in 2013 and 2015, and that included 20 countries, and all the P5 members, so Russia, China, the US, UK, but also included Germany and included a number of countries throughout the world, endorsed that as a norm. And I think it's getting a lot of traction, but I think this is where this community could be really valuable, is to say why that's an important norm, and again, work with the policymakers in your country to get more widespread application of that, because I think that is something that I think is an important one to observe. I think people understand it, at a visceral level pretty easily, and so I think that's something I'd like to see more traction on. There has been traction, though. Yeah.
So a follow-on, some national certs are having a different configuration with regard to national security agencies than others. How would that factor into this norm?
So I think even some of the early certs were set up in national security agencies and defense agencies. The issue here is their mission has to be one of defensive purposes. And they can be defensive purposes even in those agencies and not offensive purposes. So I think we think certs should be used for good. Doesn't mean countries can't have offensive capabilities because they're all developing them, but that's really somewhere else.
We have time for one more question.
Hello. I used to work in law enforcement as well in the UK, and one of the biggest problems we had was getting evidence quickly from different countries. So I think my question is in two parts. In part of the conversations that you've had and heard in these cross-country collaborations, has there been a component around ensuring some of the big corporates and the big social media or the big companies who have logs, who have evidence, provide it more quickly? Yeah. Is there more kind of expansion in those departments? Because when you'd send it up to the law enforcement, it'd go across, wouldn't it, to the country and down again, then up and then down again. And that could take about 2 years. And has there been any kind of improvement in that time frame?
Yeah, this is one of the big problems when I was at Justice, but it continues to this day. And there are two things we've done to address it. One is this 24/7 network I mentioned that was started within the G8, but now is over 60 countries. That's supposed to provide what's called a fast freeze, slow thaw sort of thing. So you make sure the evidence is still there, because you guys all know the evidence could disappear really quickly, and especially if you have to go back several hops, it could disappear. So make sure the evidence is there, really quick cooperation among countries. You can call this 24/7 network, which, as its name implies, it operates 24/7, so you can get that evidence frozen and then use whatever legal process you can go further. So that solves part of it. It doesn't solve all of it. The other problem is the issue of getting evidence. A lot of the evidence is now in the U.S. That's going to change over time because cloud services and other things are going to be based other places. There was a recent, when I was at the White House and at State, we worked to try to negotiate some agreements where we needed a law in place that allowed easier access of evidence between countries. So the UK was the first country that proposed this with the US, and we negotiated that with the UK, or started to. And they just recently in the US passed the Cloud Act, it's called, which allow companies to share information with other governments within particular circumstances. And you have to have an agreement to do that. And one of the key things is having due process, rule of law, but it allows a much quicker access between countries. And one of the reasons that's important is there's many reasons it's important. First, it's important for solving law enforcement cases, but it's also important because countries would say, look, because it's so hard to get the data from you, we're going to force your companies to have data here. We're going to do data localization, which we think is bad for lots of different reasons. It can mean it would create an adversarial relationship that we really didn't need with those countries. We want to have more of a cooperative relationship. So this Cloud Act, I think, is important. The one thing I'd say, it enables this. The one thing I'd say is now we have to reach agreements with each of those countries, or the US does, to enable that to actually work. That's going to take time, but I think it's an important development. And there's also some efforts like the Internet. There's a group called the Internet Jurisdiction Project, which is doing a lot of good work. There's a lot of work in this area. I want to thank all of you. That's my, if anyone's interested in following movie posters, the Hackers and Computers, that's my Twitter handle. I'm at 33 now. I'm hoping to get to at least 52. But if you have any ideas for ones that I haven't hit, feel free to suggest them.
Thanks, Chris.